What if the real problem was never your inability to fit in, but the fact that you've spent your entire life trying to fit into places that required you to betray yourself? Think about that for a moment. How many times have you walked into rooms, talked to people, joined groups, smiled, agreed, tried to be pleasant, and still gone home with that quiet feeling that something inside you remained disconnected? As if there were an invisible distance between your mind and the rest of the world. Not because you were physically alone, but because psychologically you almost never seemed to be operating on the same level as everyone else. Maybe you've tried to convince yourself it was just shyness. Maybe you called it insecurity, oversensitivity, social awkwardness. Maybe you believed for years that if you learned to be lighter, more spontaneous, simpler, you would finally find that much talked about sense of belonging. But no matter how hard you tried to soften your tone of voice, hide the intensity of your thoughts, or dim your own perception so you wouldn't seem too complicated, deep down, the feeling remained. The feeling that there was something in the way your psyche worked that simply could not settle into the kind of superficiality that seems to satisfy so many people. And that is exhausting. It is exhausting to fake naturalness in conversations that say nothing. It is exhausting to smile in environments that drain your energy. It is exhausting to feel like you have to filter what you think, what you feel, and what you perceive so you don't make people uncomfortable. Little by little, you start to think the fault must be yours. After all, if everyone else seems able to adapt, why are you the only one carrying this constant discomfort? Why are you the only one who feels out of place even in spaces where, theoretically, you should feel at ease? That question eats away at you in silence because it doesn't just attack your social life, it attacks your identity. It makes you wonder whether there is something fundamentally wrong with the way you are. But it was precisely about this conflict between the social mask and the inner essence that Carl Jung wrote in almost brutal terms. Jung said that the farther a person lives from their own center in order to meet external expectations, the greater the sense of emptiness, disconnection, and psychic fragmentation becomes. In other words, maybe your suffering does not come from being inadequate. Maybe it comes from trying to survive inside structures that demand a reduced version of your consciousness. And when the soul is forced to compress itself for too long, it starts screaming through exhaustion, withdrawal, silence, and that haunting sense of not belonging. What almost no one realizes is that some people were simply not built to fit in easily, because their minds reject, even without knowing how to explain it, anything that feels too artificial, too small, too shallow. And before you assume that means arrogance, coldness, or an inability to coexist with others, there is an uncomfortable truth that has to be faced, because maybe your pain was not born where you think it was. And if hearing this gave you that strange feeling of recognition, as if someone were finally putting words to a discomfort you've carried for years, then go ahead and leave your like on this video right now. That simple gesture helps this message reach other people who are also sitting in silence, believing they are too difficult for this world, when maybe they are simply living through a deep conflict between who they are and what is expected of them. And I want to ask you something sincerely. Comment below, "I never fit in," if this feeling has been with you for as long as you can remember. Because when you read other stories like yours, when you realize there is a silent crowd feeling the exact same disconnection, something changes inside you, the pain stops feeling like an isolated flaw and starts to make sense. This channel exists for exactly that reason, to talk about deep psychology, self-knowledge, the shadow, awakening consciousness, human behavior, and Carl Jung's ideas that explain what most people feel but cannot name. So if this kind of content speaks to your mind, take a moment now and subscribe to the channel. Because the next videos are going to show you even more intense aspects of rare personalities, non-belonging, human perception, and psychological transformation, themes that can radically change the way you see yourself. And I say that because there is one interpretation mistake that makes many people suffer twice as much. They do not just feel out of place, they believe that this displacement means weakness. When the truth may be the exact opposite. They do not just feel out of place, they believe that this displacement means weakness, when the truth may be the exact opposite. Because there is a brutal difference between not being able to fit in and not being able to fit in without erasing yourself. And most people never realize that distinction. They spend years trying to interpret their own discomfort as a personal flaw, as if the pain came from some social deficiency, some inability to adapt, some internal problem that needs fixing. So they change the way they speak, control their reactions, tone down their intensity, hide their opinions, force smiles, join conversations they would never tolerate by choice, all in the name of one quiet hope, finally feeling like they belong. But that belonging never fully arrives. At best, what arrives is a partial acceptance, exhausting and conditional. You are tolerated when you simplify yourself. You are included when you soften your own depth. You are understood superficially when you offer only the lightest part of yourself. And even then, when everything is over, that internal sense of estrangement remains, as if the interaction were happening only on the outer layer while the truest part of your psyche is still standing outside, watching without ever fully entering. This is one of the loneliest experiences a person can live through, because on the outside it looks like everything is working. You have contacts, conversations, sometimes even groups. But inside, there is this awareness that almost nothing touches the central room of your consciousness. Maybe you've felt this at parties, family gatherings, work, old friendships, even relationships. You are there, physically present, responding, participating, but there is a quiet part inside you asking, why does this feel so empty? Why do I still feel distant? Why does everything seem to require an edited version of me? And the more this repeats, the more you begin to feel as if there is something defective in the way you exist. After all, if others seem to move naturally through these dynamics, why does it take so much psychic effort for you? That question hurts because it does not merely accuse your social skills, it accuses your identity. You begin to distrust your own essence. You begin to think maybe you are too intense, too complex, too sensitive, too observant. And from there, a dangerous process of self-compression begins. You start negotiating who you are in order to reduce friction with the world. But constantly negotiating who you are creates a kind of fatigue that does not show up all at once, it seeps in. First as social exhaustion. Then as disinterest in environments crowded with superficiality. Then as a growing desire for silence. Then as selective withdrawal. Until one day you realize you are not just tired of people, you are tired of performing normalcy in places that do not feed your soul. Carl Jung spoke about the persona, the social mask we wear in order to coexist. We all have one, that is inevitable. The problem begins when the persona becomes so dominant that the person can barely find space for the expression of the true self. In simple terms, when you spend too much time sustaining a socially acceptable version of yourself and too little time living what is inwardly real, the psyche begins sending signals of discomfort. Not because you are antisocial, but because you are psychically distant from yourself. That is why certain environments exhaust you for no apparently logical reason. It is not just the noise. It is not just the number of people. It is the amount of performance required. It is the need to smile when there is no truth. To agree when there is no connection. To seem light when the mind is processing 1,000 layers. Your energy disappears because it is not just coexistence, it is coexistence under identity compression. And few people realize how slowly this destroys the sense of belonging. Because the more you have to adapt in order to be accepted, the less real that acceptance feels. Deep down, the mind knows, they are not accepting who I am, they are accepting the version of me that does not threaten the dynamic. That perception, even when not fully conscious, creates a profound emptiness. You begin to be in places and still feel absent. You begin to receive attention and still feel invisible. You begin to have company and still feel a kind of psychological exile. Maybe that is why solitude, for you, was never just being alone. It was recovering integrity. It was stopping the editing of your sentences. Stopping the filtering of your reactions. Stopping the shrinking of your own consciousness so you would not seem like too much. Alone, you breathe because you do not have to fit. And that detail says far more than it seems. Because people who feel relief the moment they leave social environments are not necessarily running from people, often, they are running from the internal distortion that happens when they try to belong at any cost. But there is still one very common interpretation that makes all of this look like a simple problem of shyness or introversion, when the psychological root may be far deeper, and far less obvious, than people imagine. If this feeling of being present without ever feeling fully inside makes sense to you, comment, "I edit myself too much." The psychological root may be far deeper, and far less obvious, than people imagine. Because when someone hears that they cannot fit in, the immediate interpretation is almost always simplistic: it must be shyness, it must be low self-esteem, it must be social difficulty. That is the ready-made narrative society offers. If you do not flow naturally in every environment, then the problem must be your ability to coexist. If you do not feel comfortable in groups, it must be insecurity. If you prefer silence over empty interaction, then you must be isolating yourself too much. But what if none of those explanations touch the real root? What if your sense of not belonging does not come from a social flaw, but from a psychic incompatibility with what most people call normal? That changes everything, because it forces you to question a very old belief, the belief that adapting is always a sign of health. It is not. Sometimes, adapting excessively is simply learning to tolerate what internally disorganizes you. That is why so many people seem functional on the outside and exhausted on the inside. They learned how to fit, but at the cost of continuous wear and tear. And maybe you did that for years without realizing it. You learned to laugh in moments when you felt disconnected. You learned to carry conversations your mind wanted to leave within the first few minutes. You learned to appear sociable while internally counting the time until you could return to your own space. You learned not to express certain perceptions because you knew they would be seen as unnecessary intensity. The world taught you techniques for coexistence, but it never taught you to ask whether that coexistence was costing you too many pieces of yourself. And here is the perspective shift that almost no one is willing to face: maybe your suffering does not come from an inability to enter these places. Maybe it comes from the lucidity to realize that many of these places simply do not match your inner structure. I know that sounds arrogant at first. It sounds as if we are saying that you are somehow superior or too special for ordinary environments. But this is not about superiority. It is about psychic frequency. Some people can function just fine on social autopilot because they do not feel that much friction between who they are and what the environment demands. Others feel that friction all the time. They feel it when they have to reduce their depth to maintain artificial lightness. They feel it when they have to ignore inconsistencies to preserve relationships. They feel it when they have to fake enthusiasm for dynamics that produce no real truth. And feeling that friction over and over again creates a kind of exhaustion that cannot be solved by simply trying to be more open. Maybe that is why you have walked into places that were, in theory, perfectly pleasant and, even without any objective reason, wanted to leave early. You have been surrounded by good people and still felt disconnected. You have taken part in normal conversations and walked away mentally drained. Because exhaustion does not always come from bad environments, sometimes it comes from environments that are incompatible with your need for psychological authenticity. That is a huge difference. It is not that everything is toxic. It is that not everything is livable for your consciousness. Carl Jung observed that the more a person distances themselves from their own nature in order to meet external demands, the greater their internal neurosis becomes. In simple terms, the soul becomes ill when it spends too much time in places where it cannot express itself without mutilation. And mutilation here is not physical, it is psychic. It is swallowing your observation so you do not seem too deep. It is hiding your discomfort so you do not seem too sensitive. It is accepting superficiality so you do not seem too demanding. It is tolerating loose, hollow connections because the alternative would be appearing too distant. Little by little, you no longer know whether you are socializing or merely surviving socially. This is the point where many people begin calling themselves complicated. But perhaps the right word is incompatible. Incompatible with excessive noise. Incompatible with relationships that have no substance. Incompatible with bonds sustained only by habit. Incompatible with environments where everything revolves around performance and almost nothing revolves around truth. Do you see how the interpretation changes? Because complicated sounds like an internal defect. But incompatible points to a mismatch between your psyche and certain forms of human interaction. And once that distinction sinks in, an uncomfortable question is born. How many times have you called weakness what was really just your internal system rejecting what does not nourish it? That question matters because it dismantles years of self-criticism. Maybe you did not fail to fit in. Maybe you felt, consciously or unconsciously, that fitting into certain structures would cost too much of your integrity. But before turning that into relief, there is an even deeper layer that needs to be understood, because we are not talking merely about personal preference or lifestyle, but about a psychological mechanism that Carl Jung described in an astonishing way. If this reversal is shifting the way you see yourself, comment, maybe I'm incompatible. We are not talking merely about personal preference or lifestyle, but about a psychological mechanism that Carl Jung described in an astonishing way. Jung understood that the human being lives in constant conflict between what they are internally and what they learn to represent externally. On one side there is the self, the psychic essence, the truest center of the personality. On the other side there is the persona, the adaptive mask used to move through the world without excessive friction. At moderate levels, this is natural. We all use some kind of persona. The problem begins when the distance between the self and the persona becomes too large. And in deeply perceptive people, that distance hurts much faster. Why? Because certain minds cannot remain anesthetized in performance for very long. They feel when they are pretending. They feel when the conversation is empty. They feel when the connection is merely functional. They feel when the energy of the environment demands an overly simplified version of themselves. While many people can spend years sustaining automatic interactions without major internal conflict, some personalities experience a kind of psychic suffocation. They cannot call it belonging when it requires self-abandonment. They cannot call it peace when it depends on constant internal filtering. They cannot call it friendship when it survives only on the surface. And that is precisely why they are often seen as selective, distant, or hard to please. But the issue is not social pickiness. It is a hunger for truth. That is a central phrase here, psychological truth. People like you usually do not suffer only because they are alone. They suffer because what they find rarely feels genuine enough to sustain the soul. There are meetings, there are groups, there are exchanges, but everything feels contaminated by too much performance, too much noise, too much social role-playing. The mind notices when almost every dialogue revolves around image maintenance, external validation, convenience, and habit. And when the psyche is highly sensitive to that, a silent aversion to automatic social interaction begins to grow. Maybe you have already noticed that it is not the number of people that determines your exhaustion, but the psychic quality of their presence. You can spend hours with someone who radiates authenticity and not feel drained. And you can spend 15 minutes in a superficial environment and walk away internally exhausted. That happens because your energy does not respond only to social stimulation, it responds to emotional coherence. Where there are too many masks, your mind works double. Where there is truth, it relaxes. Jung also spoke about the shadow, that which each person hides, represses, or refuses to admit within themselves. And the more intuitive and observant a personality is, the more easily it perceives the shadow moving through relationships. It sees vanity disguised as humility, competition disguised as friendship, control disguised as care, self-interest disguised as kindness. For many people this passes unnoticed, but for certain forms of consciousness it produces immediate static. It is as if the soul says, something is misaligned here. And repeatedly living with misalignment without being able to name it all the time creates an almost existential exhaustion. This detail is important because it explains why you may never have been able to feel completely at ease in conventional social structures. It was not simple dislike. It was not merely a preference for being alone. Your psyche was reacting to the excess unconsciousness around you. Reacting to interactions without depth. Reacting to environments where form matters more than substance. And that does not mean you think you are better than other people. It simply means your mind is not nourished by the same type of stimulation that nourishes most people. While many are satisfied with participation, you seek meaning. While many feel included through presence, you need resonance. While many tolerate social masks as an inevitable part of life, you feel each mask as a small fracture in the possibility of real connection. Do you see how that changes the narrative? The problem is not simply, I don't know how to fit in. The problem is that your psychic structure may have been built to detect everything that makes fitting in feel too artificial. And when the soul identifies continuous artificiality, it resists. Sometimes in the form of silence. Sometimes in the form of withdrawal. Sometimes in the form of sudden disinterest in people everyone else considers pleasant. Not because you want to be inaccessible, but because some deep part of you does not easily accept what does not vibrate with truth. But seeing this brings a painful consequence. The more you understand why you cannot fit into many places, the more you realize the price you paid trying to fit in anyway. And this is where the story stops being only about social incompatibility and starts touching an even more serious wound, the wound of having abandoned entire parts of yourself just so you would not be left out. If this psychological mirror feels far too accurate, comment, I can feel when it isn't real. The story stops being only about social incompatibility and starts touching an even more serious wound, the wound of having abandoned entire parts of yourself just so you would not be left out. Because when you spend years trying to belong in structures that do not match your nature, adaptation stops being an occasional gesture and becomes a pattern of self-erasure. At first it seems harmless. You only avoid certain topics so you do not seem too intense. You only hold back certain opinions so you do not create discomfort. You only laugh when in truth you feel disconnected. You only tolerate dynamics that drain you internally because you believe everyone does the same thing. But repeated long enough, that only turns into a deep process of internal distancing. You stop showing how you really think. Then you stop reacting the way you truly feel. Then you stop even recognizing what you actually want. Because the silent priority becomes this: maintain acceptance. And maintaining acceptance in incompatible environments almost always requires small daily betrayals against your own essence. Maybe that is why many people reach a certain stage of life with a strange sense of emptiness, even while being socially integrated. It is not lack of company. It is not lack of activity. It is lack of self. The person looks at their routine, their relationships, the groups they belong to, and feels one mute question echoing, when did I get this far away from my truth? That question hurts because there is no single major event to blame. It happened little by little, in the name of coexistence, adaptation, practicality, social peace. Carl Jung warned that everything pushed into the shadow does not disappear, it returns in the form of symptoms, restlessness, nameless irritation, emptiness, and loss of meaning. And that explains a lot. It explains why deeply adapted people sometimes feel mysteriously tired. It explains why relationships that are good on paper fail to provide emotional nourishment. It explains why acceptable environments create suffocation. It is not ingratitude. It is the shadow of the neglected self-demanding space. The more you repress authenticity in order to maintain fit, the more the psyche protests. But the protest of the psyche rarely comes in clear sentences. It comes as social discouragement. It comes as the urge to isolate. It comes as impatience with superficiality. It comes as growing irritation with predictable conversations. It comes as the feeling of being surrounded and yet internally alone. Many people interpret this as a mood problem, ordinary fatigue, or just a bad phase. But sometimes it is something deeper. It is an identity exhausted from sustaining a persona that does not represent it. You are not merely tired of people. You are tired of not being able to exist fully among them. And that difference is enormous. Because when the problem is only social, rest helps. When the problem is self-abandonment, rest alone is not enough. Think of how many times you may have said, "I don't know why I'm feeling this way," when deep down your psyche knew exactly why. It knew it was saturated with concessions. Saturated with environments where it had to measure every word. Saturated with connections where it could not go deep. Saturated with maintaining a manageable image while the mind craved truth, density, silence, and authenticity. The issue is that this awareness does not always arrive fully formed. Often it first appears as diffuse unease, as the desire to disappear, as a growing inability to tolerate what is artificial. That is where many people enter into conflict with themselves. Because one part wants to keep fitting in so it does not lose its bonds. But another part is far too tired to keep deforming itself. One part wants acceptance. The other wants integrity. One part fears seeming distant. The other can no longer stand seeming like a reduced version of itself. This internal battle wears you down more than any external conflict, because you feel that every choice comes with a cost. If you keep adapting, you lose vital energy. If you begin to stand your ground and pull away, you fear being misunderstood or seen as difficult. So you stay stuck in the middle, not truly belonging, yet not truly freeing yourself either. And living in that psychic middle ground slowly corrodes self-esteem, because the person begins to feel incapable of being either fully accepted or fully authentic. Maybe that is why some of your greatest crises did not arise in moments of explicit rejection, but in seemingly normal moments, when suddenly everything felt meaningless. Because the soul does not collapse only when it is attacked. Sometimes it collapses when it realizes how long it has lived domesticated. And recognizing that is painful, but it also opens an important door, the understanding that perhaps the mistake was never failing to fit in, the mistake was insisting on fitting into places that cost you your identity. But this realization only becomes liberating when you discover an even stronger truth: not every exclusion is a loss, and not every loneliness is a sign of psychological failure. If this section described an exhaustion you did not know how to name, comment, "I erased myself to fit in." Not every exclusion is a loss, and not every loneliness is a sign of psychological failure. This is one of the hardest shifts to accept because we were conditioned to associate belonging with emotional success. From an early age, we learn that being integrated means being well, that being accepted by groups means being on the right path, that moving easily among people is proof of balance. So when we feel out of place, the automatic conclusion is, "I must be failing at something." But what if, in many cases, feeling out of place is less a defect and more an internal protection system? What if your psyche has been refusing what your conscious mind still insisted on calling necessary? It is uncomfortable to think this way, because it dismantles years of chasing approval. It means admitting that perhaps you spent too much energy trying to walk through doors that would never have led to places livable for your soul. And here is the powerful insight: there are environments from which you were not excluded, you were preserved. There are connections that did not flourish not because you were insufficient, but because maintaining those connections would have required increasingly artificial versions of you. There are groups where your presence always seemed misplaced because your nature could never have blossomed there without amputations. This perspective is not self-pity. It is discernment. Discernment is when you stop asking only, "Why didn't they want me?" and start asking, "What exactly would I have had to sacrifice to be fully accepted there?" That question shifts the entire emotional axis. Because in many cases the answer is harsh: you would have had to sacrifice depth, silence, authenticity, selectiveness, critical vision, the need for truth. In other words, you would have had to sacrifice precisely the most valuable elements of your psychic constitution. And when the price of belonging is that high, exclusion stops looking like tragedy and starts looking like delayed rescue. Carl Jung spoke about individuation as the process of becoming who you are, instead of remaining dissolved in the expectations of the collective. Individuation means that there comes a point when psychological health is no longer about being absorbed by every environment, but about discerning which environments do not deserve to absorb you. It sounds like a nuance, but it is an internal revolution. The person stops chasing universal validation and starts protecting their own psychic coherence. Stops begging for fit and starts observing compatibility. Stops interpreting solitude as humiliation and starts seeing it as a space for recalibration. Maybe that is why some forms of distance that once hurt are now beginning to make sense. Maybe certain friendships that grew cold were relief in disguise. Maybe some declined invitations preserved your energy. Maybe not being everywhere kept you from losing yourself even more. When this awareness sinks in, something changes in your posture. You no longer feel that same desperate urgency to be understood by everyone. You no longer care so much about proving warmth in shallow environments. You no longer force yourself to maintain dynamics just because they appear socially correct. A new kind of selectiveness appears, less anxious and more lucid. It is not defensive isolation. It is psychic economy. You begin to realize that your mental energy is too valuable to distribute indiscriminately in spaces that give back nothing but noise. This is the sense of power many people never experience because they spend their entire lives trying to please the collective. Power not in the arrogant sense, but in the sense of no longer depending on any audience to validate your existence. The power to leave places without guilt. The power to be silent without needing to justify it. The power not to perform emotional accessibility all the time. The power to understand that compatibility matters more than popularity. And when that power is born, something curious happens: loneliness changes flavor. It stops being merely proof that you were not welcomed and becomes, many times, the natural consequence of having stopped accepting incompatible connections. That hurts on certain days, of course. But it is a very different pain from the pain of betraying yourself to be accepted. One hurts because of the absence of certain bonds. The other hurts because of the absence of self. And the absence of self always costs more. But there is a delicate detail here. Not every person who pulls away is awakening. Some are simply shutting down. Not every form of selectiveness is wisdom. Sometimes it can also hide wounds, fears, and walls built over time. And that is exactly why one more uncomfortable question still needs to be faced. When you say you were not born to fit in, is that coming from your consciousness, or from the parts of you that are still trying to protect themselves? If this shift brought you relief, comment: not every exclusion is a loss. When you say you were not born to fit in, is that coming from your consciousness, or from the parts of you that are still trying to protect themselves? That question is uncomfortable because it prevents the story from ending in a simple feeling of silent superiority. Being different can feel liberating when we finally understand that not every environment deserves our adaptation. But there is a hidden risk: turning lucidity into a wall, turning discernment into closure, turning selectiveness into permanent exile. And many people do this without realizing it. After years of feeling out of place, misunderstood, psychically drained, and forced to wear social masks, they arrive at an apparently strong conclusion: I don't need anyone, I don't belong anywhere anyway, it's better to stay alone. On one level this seems like legitimate protection. And sometimes it is. But on another level it may simply be a psyche too exhausted to risk new deformation. The soul says it chose solitude out of awareness, but in some layers it is still choosing it because it can no longer bear being frustrated. Do you see the difference? One thing is pulling away because you recognized real incompatibilities. Another is pulling away because you have lost trust that connection can exist without self-abandonment. On the surface the two movements look the same: silence, selectiveness, distance, fewer bonds. But internally they are opposites. In the first there is power. In the second there is defense. And if you do not investigate this honestly, you may call awakening what is still just a wound trying not to be touched. Carl Jung said that what does not become conscious returns as fate. That sentence carries enormous weight here. Because if you never look at the fears hidden behind your selectiveness, you run the risk of spending the rest of your life repeating isolation and calling it identity. You run the risk of believing you were not born to fit in when, in part, perhaps you have also unlearned how to trust spaces where you could exist fully. You run the risk of turning your own depth into an excuse never to expose yourself to any demanding bond again. And this is delicate, because intense people usually do have real reasons to protect themselves. They have felt misunderstood, drained, diminished, boxed in. They noticed the artificiality in many people far too early. They paid dearly for trying to belong. So the impulse to close doors seems sensible. But the individuation Jung proposes is not becoming stone. Individuation does not mean withdrawing from everything, it means learning to exist without betraying yourself. There is a massive difference between those two things. The closed-off person says, I don't want anyone near me anymore. The individuated person says, I only allow near me what does not require my mutilation. The closed-off person abandons possibility. The conscious person refines choice. The wounded person uses loneliness as a trench. The awakened person uses solitude as a center of strength. This discernment changes the entire internal landscape because it prevents two dangerous extremes: dissolving into the collective in order to be accepted, and exiling yourself completely so you will never be hurt again. Neither of those is freedom. One is submission. The other is freezing. Psychological freedom lies in the rare and difficult middle, maintaining integrity without killing the capacity for connection. Maybe that is exactly where the question this video wanted to plant in you from the very beginning lies. Not, why have I never fit in, because now you already understand that many forms of fitting in would have cost you your essence. The deeper question is, after everything you have lived through, are you building a life coherent with your nature, or merely an emotional fortress so you never have to go through that again? Because those two things look similar from the outside. Both contain silence. Both contain selectiveness. Both contain distance from superficiality. But only one of them produces peace. The other produces hardening. And perhaps the greatest challenge for people who were not born to fit in is not finding a place in the world. Perhaps it is discovering whether their own soul still knows how to recognize a safe place when it finally appears. That is the boundary between consciousness and self-protection, and almost no one crosses that question without realizing how many internal doors they still keep locked. If this question keeps echoing inside you, comment, consciousness or protection? And if you made it this far, I want to tell you something very clearly: this video was not just content, it was a mirror. And if at any point you felt that silent tightness in your chest, that sensation of, it feels like they are describing my mind, then maybe this channel is one of the few places where you will truly feel understood. Because here we talk about deep psychology, self-knowledge, shadow, individuation, rare personality, awakening of consciousness, and the teachings of Carl Jung that help translate what so many people feel but cannot explain. So take this moment now and subscribe to the channel, especially if you felt something while listening to this message. The next videos will dive even deeper into these layers of the human mind, and each one may reveal parts of you that have been hidden for years. I also really want to know, does this message reflect what you feel? Do you truly live with this sense of not belonging, of self-erasure, of incompatibility with superficiality? Tell me in the comments. You can write, "This video is me," or share the part that hit you the hardest. The comments here become almost a meeting point between people who spent their lives thinking they were strange, when in truth they were only trying to survive in the wrong environments. If this video brought you clarity, made you feel seen, or helped you understand why you could never fit in like other people, leave your like. It helps the algorithm carry this message to more people who are in silence, believing there is something broken inside them. And share it with someone who urgently needs to hear this, that person who isolates themselves, who feels out of place, who lives exhausted from pretending to be normal and may need to understand that the problem was never simply being different. And now do not leave yet. The next video will reveal an even more disturbing psychological sign: why deeply conscious people are almost always misunderstood and end up pushing others away without even realizing it. Watch now, because this next piece may connect everything you have just discovered about yourself. Thank you for staying until the end. I'll see you in the next video.